Well, hey guys, welcome back to another week of Behind and Beyond. This week, I'm sitting down with Amanda Beggs, and we have a really awesome conversation that I can't wait for you to get to hear. We talk about the difference between conviction and condemnation. That's a concept from this past weekend sermon that I really wanted to dive into. We also talk about what it looks like to cultivate just a new amazement towards the grace that Jesus has given us. We talk through what it feels like to really experience that for the first time over and over again. We wrap up this episode with a really practical conversation about what you can do this week leading up to Easter to cultivate that remembrance and not a ritual as we approach such an exciting weekend as a church. It's a great conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it, so let's get into it. Well, hey, Amanda, welcome back.
Thanks.
Good to have you here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's always fun to have you here. It feels like everyone's just listening to like our own conversation because for those who don't know, we work together a lot. And this is just like one of my favorite mornings ever is just to get to pick your brain and ask about all the things.
So fun. I know. It's just like another day in the office.
Yeah, it's great. How were all the birthday celebrations?
Really fun.
Yeah.
We have celebrated and celebrated and celebrated. Yesterday was like the school celebration. So I think we have come to the end of the road, which is good.
Wow. That's amazing. A full weekend for you.
A full weekend.
Yeah.
Yes.
How did this weekend go for you?
Great. You know, I am working, I think, personally on listening to the lead of the Holy Spirit. And there's always those moments on like Thursday or Friday when you feel like God has given you something to say, but then all of a sudden you're super self-conscious and just think like, is this valuable at all? Did I hear correctly? Is this the direction that our church like needs this to go? And so to then see God show up inside of it is always so humbling and also so reassuring that where he leads is the right place to go, whether or not I feel like it or not.
Yeah. Well, he definitely led, and there was so many just great like pieces of gold, I feel like, from this weekend leading up to Easter. It's just like a really exciting time at Northway especially. I know, just being privy a little bit to the sermon run through, that there was so much that you had so much content prepared. It was so
much content.
You always do all of your homework, if anyone's wondering.
Yes.
And there were so many things that you had to cut just for time. I feel like you could have done 2 sermons out of this. What was something that you didn't get to say that now you're like, you know what, on the podcast, I really want to like make sure people hear this?
Yeah, I think one of the big things, there's 2 probably big things I didn't get to go into. One of them would be all of the connection to Passover. There is so much just fascinating, rich theological treasures comparing Passover to the Last Supper. So that would have been one place. But then also for time, I would have had a 4th grace. So we talked about those 3 graces that you received at the table. And the 4th one is communion with one another. And the Lord's table is a place we experience that Holy Communion with him, which we were able to talk about. But at the same time, as we're united to Christ, as you're united to Christ and I am, we are also united to each other. And there is a like proclamation of the gospel. You know, in that verse from Paul, it was every time you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And it's really a proclamation to one another, much like baptism. I think we think about that a lot more just symbolically in terms of like, I'm proclaiming my faith to you, and this is a public thing that draws us closer together. Communion is actually the exact same thing. It is all of us symbolically participating in the gospel in that way. And one of the most impactful things for me this weekend was that face-to-face communion with one another, and to look into the eyes of the saints and serve communion and just see like the beautiful diversity of the body of Christ, like all ages and shapes and sizes and abilities coming together and sharing in a meal together. You know, what a great way to cap off this Around the Table series of the power of that connection and our unity in Christ being so primary. And sometimes, you know, we allow all of these other things to define us or label us or put us inside of other tribes. But when you come to the table together, it's like, okay, you and I shared this above all else. And I think of it just as this beautiful family meal. You know, your family is out of town, and when you get to like go and regather with them and the comfort of being at home and having this great meal with everyone. And that's really, you know, we're all out in the world where God has us, but when we come together at the table, it's like coming home and knowing that we belong and we have identity and purpose. And so that personal communion moment to me this weekend was just like the enactment of our communion with one another and the grace
so good
that God gives us there.
That's so good. Yeah, it is such an equalizer. Like
Yes.
the communion table is. And I think that's something that's so important to remember that like, and I think that's been a thread that we've been weaving throughout this whole series, even of like inviting people around our tables. Like, you know, I remember that point earlier on that Dave made about when you invite someone to church, they can not feel out of place and not know what to do. But most people, you invite them around your table. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, I know what to do here. I know where to sit. I know how to kind of act. And it really brings people together. And much in the same way as communion does, that it, you know, I think people can be very divided and very divisive. And it, like you're saying, like we can just be we really feel and experience the oneness of the church in those moments. And it makes you realize like, oh, maybe that's why the Lord like gave this to us and we should do it and more than we don't.
Yeah. And I love what you said about it being an equalizer because we're all hungry and we're all thirsty. Like that is the most basic human need, just even physically, but then spiritually the same thing. Like no matter who you are or what you do or who I am and what I do, we share that need and we both can only have it met in the same way. And so I think there's just, it brings like a humility to us, just recognizing like we are all in need of the bread of life in that way.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking through a lot of different stuff I wanted to talk about with you. One was just a really sobering quote I feel like you brought to us about when was the last time we were amazed by our grace that's been given to us, by Jesus' grace that's been given to us. And I'm sure for a lot of people that was like kind of a gut check of, oh man, I'm really not. I'm kind of numb to this. What would you say, I guess first, do you ever struggle with that concept? And how do you bring yourself back to that wonder and appreciation for Jesus' grace? And what would you say to someone who's struggling with that right now? Who's like, I hear that, but I'm pretty numb to this. Like, how do you cultivate that?
That's a great question. And yes, I struggle with it all the time. I think, familiarity breeds contempt. Familiarity breeds lack of amazement. And as people who have grown up inside of the church, like it's really familiar to many of us. I think in the same way you and I work at a church. And so that's like also part of what we do. And so it's really easy to allow the gospel, which is the heart of everything, to just become old news and not that amazing. And, even in that silly plane story, every time I told it, people are like cheering. They are all in for the pilot. It is like the greatest victory, and to see that just reaction and to think about the way then we celebrate or react to the real grace that we've been given. And so I guess to come back to your question, how do I cultivate that? I think of that verse in Lamentations when the author says, I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope because of the Lord's great love. We are not consumed. His mercies never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And that calling to mind, like I called this to mind, and therefore I have hope. And so in those moments where we lack hope or gratitude, or just life even gets really stale, like how do we call that to mind? And I really do think it's that looking back and looking forward that we talked about this weekend. Like, what do I have in Jesus? And what will I have in Jesus? Because if I can remember what his finished work did, that's like my identity. That's who I am today, that I would not be outside of him. And the things that I struggle with and the insecurities and the fears, they are all settled at the cross of Christ. But then also looking forward, like the other places where we often lack is just experiencing the brokenness of the world and the pain caused by people in our lives or situations or diseases or whatever it may be. And that looking forward is there will be a better day. God is making everything new, and I can hang my hope on that. And so if I can call like who I am to mind and kind of how the world will be made right to mind, that's pretty amazing. Like to think of a world with no sickness and pain and death, that should be amazing, like to our souls. And so those are the two ways I think to begin to live into that.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. That's good for me, especially. Kind of off of that one question, I feel like whenever these kind of topics come up, I tend to ponder in my heart as like a doer and like I can leave a sermon and be like, okay, here's the 3 things I need to do better. And like, I can get into a battle of more of my will than my heart. How do we balance not forcing, something and relying on our own will and instead relying on the Spirit to like say, stir up this like more of a cultivation of gratitude? Or how do you balance that? truly like a question for myself. It's like, I just would love your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. As a doer, a fellow doer, and a fellow achiever and striver, recovering striver, it's so easy to fall into that try harder, do better. If I could just do these 3 things, then that will be solved. But for me, cultivating that and learning, I'm still a work in progress, learning, is to cultivate a very honest prayer life and say, like, God, I am super impatient with my kids all the time. My will is not enough to combat that patience, clearly, because it hasn't worked yet. But your Spirit is enough. Can you breathe life into that? And just allowing him to work, and in that humility and honesty in our prayer lives, and saying, God, I can't, but you can. Like, your Spirit is what gives me power to do this. And then to see the transformation, or even the little victories and moments, to take that example of impatience, where all of a sudden the Spirit like stills me in that moment and allows me to just like take a deep breath instead of taking out my frustration on the people I love. It's like, okay, that was the power of the Spirit at work. But it's just bringing humbly to the Lord our inability, instead of from a place of pride being like, no, I can just, if I just try harder or do better, I can knock this out. And it really is just living moment by moment, step by step with the Spirit, but not being afraid to just tell God the truth and say, I am weak in these areas and I need you, and he will show up.
That's so good. I think so often too, we have to get really desperate, and like you have to kind of run into that wall so many times of failing in your own will, I feel like, to reach that point of humility. And I feel like I've recently hit a lot of those points where I've been like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm going to stop trying to will this myself, because it's not getting me anywhere.
Work. Nope, it doesn't work.
Yeah, we still just can stay in that cycle. It can be so frustrating.
Yes.
So that is, I love that reminder of just cultivating a humble and honest prayer life, and like remembering the Lord already knows all these things.
Yes.
Like there's probably definitely more strength in us telling him. Like it's more about us getting that experience. It's not like he doesn't know what we're going to say. That's really good. Shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to talk about that whole conviction versus condemnation idea. I thought that was really strong and something that gets a little muddled in like our faith. So maybe could you define for us what's that difference between conviction and condemnation, and what does that look like in our lives to discern between the two?
This is something the Lord has really been speaking to me personally lately, the difference between the two. And condemnation comes from a place of shame and guilt, and it is that spirit of I need to do better. And it's our genuine belief sometimes that that's coming from God, that he's saying, come on, Rebekah, get it together. You need to do better. Or, this thing, work harder. And then we feel ashamed when we can't, which is what we just talked about. And so that's condemnation. But condemnation isn't God saying like, hey, you need to do better. It's God saying, I have something so much better for you. And that's like an exciting place for our hearts to live, because it's not a shame thing. It's I have something better for you. And I think about this, just like the love of a good father. Scripture says that he's going to give good gifts to his children. And I think about my own kids when they do things that they shouldn't be doing, but it's more, us as parents for their good, saying like, you can't watch that or you can't eat that because there's something so much better that you don't know about. And when our hearts connect with a place of conviction and saying like, okay, God, I can't see it because what I like, what I enjoy seems like the good way. But if you're saying you have something better, I need to trust that you have something better. And so our conviction is really us laying down our rights, relinquishing our rights to say like, I know best, I'm in control, this is like what's good for me, and saying, God, I trust you. I know that if you're saying this is better. And even, we talked about the garden a little bit this weekend, but that idea of the root of that lie is you can't trust God. Like you can't trust that he's good, that he really loves you, that he is going to give you a good gift, that he wants what's best for you. And that's the great lie that we're so easily swayed into believing. But conviction is saying, even when I can't see why or it doesn't make sense, I'm going to trust that God's way is the best way, because he's a good father who wants to give us good gifts. And it really is, it's a place of surrender, because often we can't see it. Like you look at things where we places in our lives where we feel conviction and it's like, I know this is probably not what God is asking me to do. But then it's the taking the step of trust. Like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and lean into where I feel like God is leading me.
Yeah, that's so good. That piece about the garden too, I want to come back to that because for anyone who missed it, in the sermon, you made this really cool connection about how the words take and eat in the garden spoke condemnation over Adam and Eve. And then Jesus brings it full circle and redeems those same words when he does the Last Supper and says, take and eat, and this is my body, this is my blood shed for you. First of all, where did you learn that from? Or like, how did the Lord speak that into your sermon? That was so cool.
I found the connection in a couple different commentaries I was reading. I have never made that connection before, that it was a redemption. Like, so much of what Jesus does is a redemption of what has happened, in the story of humanity from the beginning of time until the time of Jesus and then into the future also. And to me, that was so particularly powerful because we also are taking and eating all the time. And that is what brings us into places of condemnation. Like, we give into our hunger and our appetites and our impulse. Yeah. And then we feel shame. Adam and Eve hid when they feel shame. That's what we feel tempted to do, is to run from God because we feel super far from him. But then to think about on the cross, he gets rid of that shame and says, take and eat my body, my sacrifice for you. This week of Easter, the death and resurrection of Jesus makes it so we can live without shame. And so at the cross, those words did become words of salvation. Like, as we participate in the body and blood of Christ, like he, not in communion, but in terms of believing in him for salvation, that's where he brings us to a place of salvation, and we don't have to live in shame or condemnation or hiding.
I love that. So thank you. That was so powerful. Is there anything, as we just thinking about the timeliness of this? I mean, this will be when people are listening to this, we're right, like almost up to Easter. Is there anything from this sermon that you see like as a way to look forward with joy towards Easter, or anything you want people to like meditate on, maybe through Good Friday to Easter Sunday, or I don't know, however you want to take that?
I think as we are moving through Holy Week right now, it's coming back to that idea of ritual versus remembrance. And a lot of times, just like we take sacred moments carved out by Jesus, like communion or even baptism, and turn them into ritual, we often do that with sacred days in the church calendar, like Christmas and Easter. And we have things that we do or traditions that we follow, and a small piece of that is carving out a time to remember inside of church, and then it's just going about our lives. But to take ritual, like, how do we take ritual when it comes to Easter and move into that place and posture of remembrance where it's an experience? It's intentionally calling something to mind. And so what does that look like for us this week? What does that look like for you, the people listening, to intentionally call this to mind? And that might mean, you're going to take 10 minutes each morning and read from this day of Holy Week and all of the Gospels and really just ask God to make that come alive to you. Maybe as a family on Thursday, you're going to wash each other's feet to reenact what that looked like, so you can, just like we said, Jesus wants us to smell and see and taste and touch the gospel, to like participate in that way. Or on Friday, on Good Friday, I know at many of our locations we have like an experiential Good Friday thing where you can experience or remember what Jesus did on the cross, but making those things a priority to intentionally remember to, and do that as husbands and wives, or with your kids too, to do that together. Just asking that question, like, is this becoming a ritual? And if it is becoming a ritual, how can I take it from something I know to something I experience? And maybe it's, listening to certain music and taking a walk and just worshiping and singing songs about the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's so many things we can do, but I think if we this week are moving from ritual to remembrance by the time we get to Easter on Sunday, just to bring it full circle, that experience of amazing grace and the victory we have in Jesus, that the head of the serpent is crushed, all of those things that we celebrate on Easter, that will become real to us because we have been in that posture of not just knowing, but experiencing.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Well, yeah, let's all like maybe rewind, listen to that again. Like, that is just some really good practical just guidance for this week. And I just love that reminder of just the importance of remembering and not just going through the motions. What a powerful reminder. So yeah, thank you, Amanda, for your time.
Yeah, this was great.
Thanks for being here as always. And thank you guys for listening, for watching, and we'll see you next week. Happy Easter, everybody.
Happy Easter.